The Sandbox is a video game term that has carried over to Dungeons & Dragons, and it essentially means that you are free to do whatever you want, whenever you want, and some people try to run D&D campaigns like this, and I highly, highly recommend that you don't.
Riser, double.
I take how much damage? So in the world of Dungeons & Dragons campaigns, there are like 3 or 4 major category types, and then there is a whole bunch of subcategory types that even if I had all the time in the world to make a video on every single campaign type, I would never be able to breach it because of all the subtypes. But for now, we'll be focusing on the major types and one specific one, the Sandbox. So you have the story-driven campaign mode, which has very, very little combat and is often centered around roleplay. You have the adventure campaign mode, where there is a certain point on the map where the characters have to make it to, and then everything that happens from one point to the other point is what happens. These are often the most healthy mix of roleplay and combat. You have the dungeon crawling campaign, which is literally just taking your players and putting them from one dungeon to another, to another, to another, to another. And then finally, you have the dungeon crawler campaign, which is the most combat heavy main type, where you take your players and you put them in a dungeon. And then once they finish that dungeon, you put them in a city so that they can find the next dungeon, and then they just go to another dungeon, and then it's literally Dungeons and Dragons. And then finally, you have the Sandbox, which is what we'll be talking about today, which is the most aimless type of campaign. The Sandbox is pretty much has no overarching story. It is literally putting your players in a world, giving them the setting, and then telling them to pick a fucking direction and see what happens. And this seems cool at first. It actually seems like a great experience to give your players. They don't have a plot point they have to be desperately searching for. Every single session or every group of 5 sessions is basically its own miniature plot hook. It also gives you a great opportunity to try to get players to be able to access their goals for their characters, right? It's sometimes some people find it very difficult to incorporate player backstories into their campaign, which I actually have a video on, by the way, on how to do that properly. And so sometimes DMs will opt to run a sandbox so that they can make every player have their own little miniature story that happens within the sandbox. And while it seems like a great idea, sandboxes really don't work that well, and almost never do work. And every sandbox I've either played in or I've tried to run has fallen apart extremely quickly, and there's a few things for that. Number one, the fact that there is no overarching plot hook will often leave players kind of just looking around, and it gets very boring very fast. Because there are no particular plot hooks and because there's no destination in mind, players don't know what your world is. You can hand them a map with tons and tons of lore and all these locations and things, but I can tell you right now, players aren't gonna fucking read that. My current Homebrew campaign is set in Eberron, a very established place, with a source book for 5e, and I can tell you that none of my players have read that book. I provided them a free PDF. None of them have read that book. None of them know shit about Eberron. And I really don't expect them to, because players aren't going to go through all that. Players just want to make their characters and get into the game. They want to make their characters, they want to ask you a couple of questions to make sure their characters fit your world, and then they just want to play the game. And so no matter how much you try to hand your players about the world, it's just they're not going to read the shit. And so a lot of times players are like, we'll just go north. And then you have to go and find where they started and figure out, where they're going to end up. The second reason is that you can really only do so many miniature plot hooks before they start getting repetitive. And that's not to say that there's a limited number of plot hooks and you're gonna run out of them. That's to say that every single dungeon master gets writer's block whenever they have to come up with something. So you might have your players go to a village and go recover a necklace from a nearby bandit camp. But after that, they'll enter another village, and then they have to go and recover a stolen farming tool from another villager. It's 2 recovery quests, different, because one of them you're killing bandits, but one of them you're just going to talk to somebody. But at the same fucking time, it's still 2 recovery quests. And so very often dungeon masters will kind of fall into this trap of rehashing the same themes over and over again. Another reason is that because there's no overarching plot, there's no end in sight to the campaign. And while a never-ending Dungeons and Dragons campaign sounds amazing, eventually things have to come to an end. That's why shows like The Simpsons, South Park, and Family Guy haven't been good in 15 fucking years, because everything has to find an endpoint. At some point, at some place, things have to end, and you have to start new with new stories and new characters and new plot points and things like that. And so Sandbox games, they typically don't have an end. Now, you might think that one of the fixes for this is to put an overarching plot into the sandbox. One that's, like, maybe not very urgent. Perhaps you might have your players go on a quest to find 12 of the last dragon eggs. There's no world-ending event, but there is stories that 12 dragon eggs have been discovered, and whoever finds them might get, like, something super powerful. So a band of adventurers came together to go find the dragon eggs, which is great, and it's actually a campaign idea that I kind of had at one point, but didn't really pan out the way I would have liked it to. But one of the bigger problems with that is that because the overarching plot is so thin, very oftentimes you could go sessions and sessions without ever touching it. You know, they might say, oh, yeah, I heard the red dragon egg is off in Mondor, and Mondor is fucking, you know, 4 months travel from where they actually are. So they're gonna go off to Mondor, but I mean, during that 4-month travel period, you might go through like 10 sessions, and then what? You know what I mean? So I think that for a lot of people, a lot of the bigger issues that they run into is that the overarching plot is so thin that they end up forgetting about it, and sometimes legitimately, literally forgetting about it. Like I played in a Sandbox campaign one time where all of us within the party, we didn't touch the main plot for like 12 or 13 sessions, and by the time it was time to go back to it, we all forgot what the fucking hell we were supposed to be doing there. Kind of like how actual Sandbox video games work, you know what I mean? So I just think that it's important to understand that while a sandbox is something I think every DM should try one time, just to see how badly it turns out, I don't recommend running sandbox games because they very often fall apart way too quickly, or they go on for way too long, and the aimlessness of it all creates for a very bad experience. You know, in video games, sandboxes can work because you have quest logs and you have collectibles and you have, you know, guides that you could follow and things like that, but in something like Dungeons and Dragons, where everything is very much about making sure that everyone has a goal, it could be very difficult to keep a sandbox game running. And that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think down below. And as always, a great big special thank you for watching these videos. It's definitely been a new journey for me. You know, I already have one channel, my Dead by Daylight channel, that's mildly successful, and I didn't think anything would really come of this channel, you know, at least for a couple of years. And it turns out that, like, from the very first D&D video I posted, you guys have been loving it, and I've had several videos break 1,000 views, a couple of them break 2,000, which is insane to me. So thank you guys again for the love and the support. I really appreciate it, and yeah, I will see you in the next one.